Welcome to the Nuclear Power Institute's The Path of Most Persistent podcast. The podcast highlighting individual stories of persistence, community outreach, and inspiration to support the continuing and emerging nuclear science and technology needs across the state of Texas. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy today's podcast. Welcome to the Path of Most Persistence podcast. Today, our guest is Dr. Steven Winston. He is an independent senior technical advisor and has served in a lot of different roles over his career, including some pretty high-profile positions in a major engineering company. So I'll give it over to Steve. Do you have something that you'd like to say about yourself, or maybe some background information, and how did you get here today?
Well, my personal role model was my grandmother, believe it or not. But mine was my grandmother. She was a pioneer woman and grew up and was born on a homestead in northwestern Nebraska. Actually, when she was 6 years old, she gave soup to the band of Indians that was camped in their backyard in the sandhills of Nebraska. It turned out that little band of Indians was the remnants of Sitting Bull and his tribe, and Sitting Bull was still part of that tribe at that point. That would have been about 1886, 87, somewhere in that time frame. And she, in the year 1990, got her degree from Fremont Normal College in Fremont, Nebraska, which was 400 miles away by train from the little homestead that she grew up on. And her degree was in a nascent science called biology. Not many people were fooling around with it then, much less an 18-year-old woman. She came back and married this guy from Kentucky named Edward Winston. Her maiden name was Furman. Her first name was Edna. So it was Ed and Edna. And she went on to become the country school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse and invented a lot of the ideas of dendritic learning. And then she became the librarian and matriarch for the little town that I grew up in, northwestern Nebraska, and was the moral compass for the whole place as well. She was a whopping 5'2" tall. I think she might have weighed 90 pounds at her most. But she stood ramrod straight her entire life. And she was a fierce believer in speaking the truth to people, sometimes to their dismay. So Grandma actually encouraged people to learn something new every day. That was her mantra. She wanted me to learn Latin when I was very young. My father was a musician. He was the band leader on a ship called the Ile-de-France from 1931 to 1938. He wasn't on the first class level. It was the second deck. And he was a saxophone player, and his band played swing music. And now swing jazz, if you've ever heard it, includes 4 or 5 saxophones with this really syrupy sound. It's about the furthest thing that you could get from rock and roll. So naturally, I had to go into rock and roll because that's what he hated. He developed Parkinson's disease in the 1960s, probably as a consequence of exposure to the Spanish flu in 1918, although that didn't occur to me until we all got exposed to SARS-CoV-2. And some of you have actually enjoyed the pleasures of COVID-19 that comes with it. It turns out that Spanish flu and perhaps SARS-CoV-2, we're studying this, can lead to an opportunistic disease, which is encephalitis lethargica, that can actually cause you to go into a subsequent state of severe catatonia, late in life. So I'm actively engaged in right now in setting up a program to study the latent effects of exposure to viruses, working with Dassault Systems and with University of Arizona, and hopefully we'll reach out to folks from Texas A&M as well. But we have multiple institutions that are working on it with us. And of course, you've heard of my famous Thursday call, which is really exploding from originally 10 people to now we have 110 that join in. So it's out of control. That's a brief sketch of from grandma to now.
So Steve, I was going to ask, I have a couple different questions, but I'll do this one first, but more of a little bit of a, now you maybe outline your journey as you go from the end of graduate school to retirement, where you're probably busier than you've ever been.
Yeah.
And how, you know, and I guess I'll go ahead and ask my second question, because you've been at this long enough, and I've known you long enough that I know you have reached a point where you have seen big things come to an end.
Yep.
And so as you've been working on project, investing your life in various projects, and then those projects come to an end in some ways, there's a mindset and a perseverance that you learn as you go through things that could be disappointing, and yet they don't have to be. And so I was just curious if you could say a few words about that.
Sure. In fact, here's an interesting thing. We live in a digital world, right? Although from my perspective, we're quite likely to find it to be an analog world. And the reason for that is that analog simulations can move much more quickly than a digital simulation in many regards. Digital simulations are largely ones and zeros. Probably the most powerful analog computer that you'll ever run into is sitting between your headphones. And that analog device can process things in amazing ways. And I guess to your point, Sean, how things come to an end and how they start. The first big thing that came to an end was my high school graduation. And I was sure glad when that was over, because at 5:30 the next morning, I was in a car on my way to Lincoln, Nebraska, never to return back to Rushville ever again as a place to live. And I started my career as a banjo player at Der Loefenstein, a nightclub in Lincoln, Nebraska, and played there for years, 6 nights a week. But that came to an end, much to my chagrin, and I had to switch over to playing stuff like Creedence Clearwater Revival, which was going from playing a tenor banjo in Dixieland, in a Dixieland show band, to a form of rock and roll was a kind of an abrupt change. Now, there was another abrupt change in that same time frame when I started my career in college as a physics major. And I thought I was going to be this nuclear physicist. And I went into my professor and I said, so what kind of job will I get when I graduate with this degree in physics? And he said, job? You don't get a job, you go to graduate school. And I said, well, but I want to make some money. And he said, oh, you want to be an engineer? And he said it like it was just this pure disgust. Like there's nothing worse than, and I thought, wow, I really made him mad now, so I may as well go ahead and go all the way. And I said, so what engineering degree will make the most money? And he just was horrified that I had given up the cloth of being a physicist for sake of making money. And he didn't know. So he had to look it up in his little handy dandy advisor handbook for the University of Nebraska. And it said chemical engineering. And I said, that's what I want, the chemical engineering. So then I changed majors right away. So that was an end and a beginning. I went from being a Regents Scholarship winner to a physicist to a chemical engineering – and within a 9-month period, which was really quite a culture shock. And then I went from being a Regents Scholarship winner to a physicist to a chemical engineering within a 9-month period, which was really quite a culture shock. And then I went from being a
I was just looking to have you turn loose on all the different things you've done. So you
Oh,
worked on multiple reactors. You were active as at the National Laboratory and Westinghouse, and just looking to, lots of different things people think about changing careers or
oh,
changing
okay.
things around you, and you've climbed a lot of learning curves. Is kind of what I would.
Okay, well, yeah, I can wander through some of our shared history. And I was this young punk that had these ideas about nuclear power that we should go smaller, not bigger, and that the optimal size based on a thing called I cross C. That's inductance cross capacitance, and that's a cross product, by the way. An efficient electrical distribution system has a power factor that is usually between 0.95 and 1 lagging. The best way to do that is to geographically distribute either inductance or capacitance. And it's hard to distribute inductance. So what you do is you distribute capacitance or generation. Generation is the same thing as capacitance. But you can't afford to put 1,000 megawatt nuke every 10 miles. But you could afford to put 100 megawatt nuke every 100 megawatts every couple hundred miles, and you could distribute the power loads much more widely. It has a whole bunch of positive implications from national security, but even better, it has a lot of implications with respect to stabilizing the grid. And if you've ever heard of the North American Reliability Council, it basically connects everything from Ottawa to California, including Texas. And all the grids are interconnected. So we came up with this idea of a 100 megawatt, highly enriched power plant in 1978. We called it reactor in a can. And the idea was we'd be able to manufacture it in a factory, and we wouldn't have to do anything anywhere else. And because it was a reactor in a can, we'd never have to refuel it, and because it was highly enriched. It didn't go over very well. And Mike Lineberry told me that's the stupidest thing I ever heard of. The neutron economy is just terrible. And by the way, nobody will ever want a small nuclear power plant. So that brings us to today, where SMRs are the popular vogue.
It's the current wave of the future right now.
Yeah, it's the current wave. Even microreactors are now the current wave of the future. And so after my career ended in nuclear fuel reprocessing and it switched over to transuranic waste management, there was this place in Idaho called the Burial Ground, which sounds terribly ominous. And it was this, it's this big thing by Big Southern Butte. You've seen it many times. And now it's called the Radioactive Waste Management Complex, because that sounds better than burial ground. But in 1969, there had been a fire at Rocky Flats. Mm-hmm. And the fire at Rocky Flats ended up with, because plutonium is very pyrophoric. And as a pyrophoric material, it caught fire. And all his glove boxes got burned up and contaminated. So they did what everybody normally does, is you got junk to dispose of, send it to Idaho. Why not? And after all, it's the National Reactor Testing Station. And so they sent it to Idaho. And the governor of Idaho said, what is this stuff? Then the AEC chairman was a woman. That makes sense. Chairman is a woman, right? And her name was Dixie Lee Ray. She had dogs and short hair and a very profound view on plutonium not being very dangerous. She used to take a couple pieces of it, drop it in a glass of water, and drink the water and say, see, nothing to worry about. Mm-hmm. She went on to become governor of the state of Washington. But at any rate, she promised Governor Samuelson of Idaho in 1972 that they would get all of that stuff out of Idaho by the year 1980. So my new job was to figure out how to get all of this plutonium out of Idaho by 1980. There was only one small problem with that. We didn't have anywhere to send it. So we figured, well, we'll just dig it all up and then we'll put it in packages. And maybe we'll put it on these temporary storage pads. Yeah, that's what we'll do. And these temporary storage pads were called the Idaho Idaho Transuranic Storage Area. It's a pad. And so they started doing that, but they didn't have any place to send this stuff. So I got kind of sick of doing that, and I went to work for a little startup company called Energy Incorporated. And Energy Incorporated had been started by a guy named Chuck Rice, who was the former manager of Aerojet Nuclear, which ran the rest of the site that Allied didn't have. And they did things like a code called RELAP 4. And they came up with this idea that working with the Electric Power Research Institute, a guy named Lance Agee, I don't know if you remember Lance, no. We were going to do a transient code, and we called it RETRAN. And our transient code was going to be able to model all these transients, because RELAP at the time, RELAP 4 was a steady state code. And so that was our claim to fame, along with there was a guy named T.K. Thompson who had come from the chem plant. That was where I worked, was at the chem plant, the nuclear fuel reprocessing plant. And oh, by the way, during that time frame, I was housed at the test reactor area because he didn't have an office for me at the chem plant, and it was in the old materials test reactor building, and they needed a sucker to be the superintendent of the materials test reactor. So the very first reactor that I was in charge of was the materials test reactor, long since decommissioned. But
how many reactors have you been in charge of over the years?
Well, there's the materials test reactor. Then when I went to Westinghouse, we had a melted down reactor at Waltz Mill. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's in containment there at Waltz Mill. Then I was involved in building Kori 2 in Korea. I was involved in building the Bataan reactor at Westinghouse in the Philippines, and then the reactor down in Brazil. And the Bataan reactor has since shut down. Kori 2 still operates. And as far as I know, the Brazilian reactor still operates. I'm not sure what they do with it.
I was thinking at this point, maybe a transition in the discussion, because as we put this podcast together, we're looking to look at people like you or people that have been doing things for a while, but we're targeting our workforce here in the state of Texas and the young people that are thinking of a career. And so I think I could listen to you talk all day about the technical history of things, but we're also very interested in the personal history of times where you actually had to persevere through something, or some things that you could say if somebody who was 18, 19 years old, coming out of high school, going in first years of college, and you're the physics professor now, and they're talking to you about getting a job. What kind of advice would you give them? What kind of story would you tell them? What's that?
I'd say material science. Don't go into physics. Actually, in terms of perseverance and actually strange situations, I don't know if you've ever heard of Pit 9. I'm sure you have, Sean, but Pit 9 was one of those really strange things. It was an outgrowth of my experience in managing or dealing with the transuranic waste in the burial ground. And come the early 1990s, the Department of Energy, which had succeeded ERDA, still hadn't got the transuranic waste out of Idaho, and the governor of Idaho had actually created a situation in which if you don't get this stuff out of here, we're not going to allow you to bring any more nuclear fuel into Idaho, which is the so-called governor's agreement. And the governor's agreement still hangs heavy over the Idaho National Lab. and that it makes it very difficult for a new or for spent fuel to be brought into Idaho. But the initiative was to get the transuranic waste out of the first pit was called Pit 9. That was the one that had the most transuranic waste in it. And it was a 42-acre pit, believe it or not, a very, very large pit. And I was at Lockheed. This was before it became Lockheed Martin then. I was a vice president of Lockheed and general manager of an enterprise. And there was an opportunity to bid on cleaning up the waste in Pit 9. And I put together the successful bid with a team of people. And then we decided to bid on the Idaho National Laboratory, and we bid on that and won. And I was one of the principals in that as a vice president of Lockheed, and then Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta. And we came to Idaho. I came back to Idaho from Las Vegas. And lo and behold, now the company that had been the successful bidder on the Pit 9 project was now a subcontractor to Lockheed Martin Idaho Technologies Company. And so as an officer of Lockheed Martin Idaho Technologies Company, and the person most knowledgeable about this, I was given the unenviable task of creating these walls that prevented me from having a conflict of interest, but overseeing the project that I had originally started on Pit 9. And that put me in the odd position of now being the customer for something I had originally been the bidder on. Now that was a very uncomfortable situation, but the Lockheed company, it was called LSAT, Lockheed Martin Advanced Environmental Systems, LeMays, I guess it was what it converted to. They committed that they would do this work for a fixed price, and they would do it in accordance with a certain timetable. And so I had to oversee them, see that, and hold them to account. And about 2 years in, they realized they couldn't do it for a fixed price. So they started coming up with change orders. Well, my job was to deny those change orders, and I did. And finally, they got to the point where they said, well, we're not going to do any more work if you aren't going to approve any more change orders. And I said, if you don't do any more work, I'm going to terminate you, and you're going to have to pay back the $350 million we gave you to build this thing. And they said, well, no, we're going to go to Congress, and we're going to make you very uncomfortable, and we'll drag you to Congress. So here I am testifying before Barton's committee in Congress about why I terminated my sister company. That was kind of uncomfortable, but the funny thing is that if you knew Al Narath, who was the head of Sandia National Labs and ostensibly my boss and boss's boss, he was testifying on behalf of LeMays, and I was testifying against him. Apparently, I must have done a little better job than he did, because shortly thereafter, I reported to the chairman of the board of Lockheed Martin, a guy named Bob Stevens. And Bob said, Steve, do what you got to do. He says, I understand this is quite a contentious issue. He says, I'll tell you what, I'll hire you outside counsel so that you can do the right thing. And you won't be influenced by Lockheed Martin. And so I started talking to the outside counsel, and they said, well, you have to sue Lockheed in order to recover the money. And I said, oh, that's going to be fun. And he says, here's the deal. You are a fiduciary to the United States government, and you may be a fiduciary to Lockheed Martin, which I was. He says, but here's what you need to weigh is that Lockheed Martin can fire you. The United States government can put you in jail. So do what you think is best. That was an easy decision, by the way. So we sued Lockheed Martin. I was still an employee of Lockheed Martin. I testified before the Judge Windmill, what a name, Judge Windmill, in federal district court. And I was on the stand for like 10 days in a row, basically describing all the things that we had done. And they did everything they could to try and paint me as a person who was a traitor and everything else, which was kind of an uncomfortable thing. And we prevailed. We won the $350 million judgment, largely based on my testimony. And the judge said it was largely my testimony. And that caused Frank Menaker, who is the general counsel for Lockheed Martin, to go storming into Bob Stevens' office and say, "Why the heck do you still have Winston on your payroll?" And Bob said, "I'm not sure what you mean." He says, "Well, he just cost you $350 million. And Bob said, "Frank, if I understand this correctly, you just cost me $350 million. You lost." 2 weeks later, Frank was gone. I still am a principal advisor to the board of directors of Lockheed Martin, and that was 20 years ago. So I think there's a couple of things. One of the things is that that's a very uncomfortable situation to sue your company. The one thing that makes sense is if you adhere to what's right, you'll ultimately come out in the end. And that sounds kind of Pollyanna-ish, but the truth of the matter is that sooner or later, I think the right thing prevails. And that as a consequence, and as Sean knows this, I'm a unreconstructed, recovering idealist. I still think that there's a value in doing the right thing.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. So kind of going along with that train of thought, and going from, your beginning stages as a research engineer into a regional director to manager, and then to vice president of Lockheed Martin, which is, a major corporation or a company. Were there different ways you had to persevere through challenges at each level that you went through?
Yeah, I think part of it is outgrowing yourself. When you start off as a young research engineer, you suffer from the illusion that perhaps you have access to more knowledge and information than anybody else. And sometimes you don't listen as much as you should. And I think the thing that benefited me the most in the long run was recognizing and coming to recognizing my limitations and the limitations of my knowledge, and the opportunity to learn from everybody. And that means especially learning from the people you don't agree with. That probably means that the hardest and longest part of my path in getting to where I got was learning to be patient and to listen, and the other thing is that to respect the people around you, so that whether you agree with them or not, you give value to why they think what they think, and don't just discount them just because they think differently than you do. And usually that means that you can gain advantage in the long run. And that gaining advantage is how you get from place to place, I think. Now, I also have to confess that I fell in love with the idea of being important at one point. And I thought that was going to make me feel really cool about myself, was to be able to brag about all my titles and all those things. It wasn't very long before I realized, Sean and I have had this discussion many times, that sometimes importance is encumbered by an awful lot of headaches. And those headaches eventually got to the point where they outweighed the value of feeling like I was important. Now, I do think that it is important for people to take charge. If you're going to try and make the world better, you have to be willing to take on things that are challenges, and be willing to accept accountability and responsibility. But that doesn't mean you need to think of yourself as important. I do think that it's important to recognize the value of the mission, and then let the mission be important, but don't get caught up in feeling important yourself. Once I got over that, it was a lot easier. and and now I'm happy to say I'm not important anymore.
So I have a question for you.
Sure.
So now you're an independent contractor, an independent consultant. So how was it to go from having a full-time job where you know exactly, you knew you had insurance, you knew you were getting a regular paycheck, to all of a sudden, in my opinion, that'd be, it's exciting and scary at the same time. What made you take that leap? And why do you think you're so successful? What mentality, what helped you get there?
I think the most important thing is don't be afraid to do things for free. And the more you do for free, the more, this almost sounds biblical, but if you do a lot of things that people see value in, it's either biblical or else it's what a drug lord does. Give away free stuff until they're hooked. I'm not sure which, but probably the drug analogy is better.
I'll stick with biblical myself. So.
It is scary, but I have to confess that although to the chagrin of people who might depend on me, I probably spend more time consulting for free with people than I do in billable hours. But sooner or later, those all come back in the form of billable hours, and usually more billable hours than I can muster. In fact, right now, I'm suffering from an avalanche of opportunity that's purely a consequence of just, for instance, this Thursday call that I do that some of you participate in. There's now 110 people that participate in that. I don't get paid a penny for doing that. It takes me 10 to 20 hours a week to research the subject matter so that I can lead a conversation that's halfway sensible. But it's now expanded to where we have some of the major institutions and universities that are involved in COVID research around the world that are participating in something that's just purely accidental. I just started a call one day, and 20 calls later, it's expanded beyond belief. Now, from that, way more work than I can possibly do. So I guess you could call it marketing, or you could call it goodwill. But I think if you do things with these idea in mind that you're not a mercenary, then people recognize that you have good intentions, and if you give a sincere effort, usually they reach out because almost everybody needs some help. So I don't know that that's it. People ask me, how do you get all these jobs? I say, I don't know. Maybe it's just being easygoing. I don't know.
Well, it does seem like there's a fruitfulness to one of the things you said early on about really having a desire to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And you do the right thing with a bit of a fearlessness, like you were just describing, that comes from understanding that your importance doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Those things kind of all converge to this point where there's kind of this wealth of opportunity for somebody in your particular position.
Yeah. Well, actually, if you were asking what would I advise a young person who's embarking on a career, I'd say the first thing you got to do is get over yourself. Then you can get on with the business at hand. If you have a purpose, then it's not about you. And if you can move it beyond yourself, then you can do a lot of great things. There's a lot you can do. But if it's all about you, then maybe you'll be successful, maybe not. Maybe people will like you, but they probably won't.
Another question I had was, so earlier you had mentioned, being part of a band and having all these other passions or hobbies. How important have those been in some of those times where you struggle, you go through challenges or struggles?
It's still here. Uh, I like art. I like music. I like writing satire. I write poetry. I love to play sports. I work out all the time. I like to laugh a lot. And I spend a lot of my day trying to figure out things to laugh about. Um, uh, it's part of enjoying life. People talk about being a Renaissance person. I don't think there's any point in excluding any part of your life. There's so much to enjoy, and I'm not the best at anything, but I sure enjoy it. I enjoy playing my guitar. I enjoy playing the banjo. I love playing the mandolin. I love playing the drums. I love playing all these stuff that I even enjoy singing. And there's people that say, "Oh, please don't do that," especially the guys in the band. But the bottom line is I enjoy it, and it gives me an awful lot of pleasure. I started playing music when I was 5 years old, so that was 65 years ago, and I still do it every day. I still work out every day. I don't work out so I can brag that I work out every day. I work out because I like it. And I get something out of it. I'm a terrible nutritionist. I eat garbage. So I wish I could say that I had a good handle on it. There's a couple things that help you keep your perspective on yourself. 28 years ago, I found out I had colon cancer. So they took out half of my guts. And I had a radical right hemicolectomy, and that's on the right side. And so I'm only about half as full of it as you might imagine.
Well, sometimes you make up for it otherwise, though.
I got involved with Sean, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. How long has it been? Started the Transcending Incrementalism meetings, and
I think professionally it's been about that long, and I've told this story to others before, but I'll put it on tape here, or on, that's how old I am, on tape, but I'll put it on video. The first time I saw you, I was stranded in Idaho over Christmas season, and I was in the hotel where Idaho National Lab was at the time Argonne West, and they were having their annual Christmas party, and you were leading the band that played. I think it was 93, 94, 95.
yeah.
Like so I didn't meet you, I didn't know you, but then later it was like, oh, that was Steve.
Yeah.
But then professionally, we've known each other for a little more than 10 years.
Yeah. And we've collaborated, and I would honestly say that if you were to advise a student as to where they should be looking, there's everything in the world that's made of anything tangible is made of material. Materials therefore comprise the things with which we make stuff. And that means material science is really the future in every way you can imagine. If you go back to even the movie, The Graduate, there was Dustin Hoffman's coming out party, and he was graduating from college. That's why he called The Graduate, I guess. And he's getting the advice of this important businessman, and he says, "Son, the future is in plastics." Well, he was right. The future in 1970 was plastics, or was it 68? I don't remember. But what he really meant was material science, because plastic is just another material, and that's the thing from which we make stuff. And the methods for making stuff are probably more important than the stuff we make. And it doesn't matter whether you're in making nuclear fuel or making lightweight panels for cars. You still are looking at many of the same principles. You're looking at thermodynamics, you're looking at strength of materials, you're looking at tensile strength, you're looking at compressive strength, you're looking at all these measures that have to do with the performance of those materials. And weight matters, conductivity matters. There's so much that you need to learn, and the future is going to be not just additive manufacturing, which is the current vogue, but I predict in the next 10 years, everybody will be looking at subtractive manufacturing, which will be the use of things that can do things on an atomic scale, and then manipulating things at the atomic scale. So if there's any part of the future of science, it's all deeply embedded in material science. And believe it or not, that's not an advertisement for your program, but it sort of is, I guess.
You know, our program is fine with that. In fact, that's kind of what I do for a living within nuclear energy myself. So
yeah.
So, but it's just our program's not picking sides on that one.
Yeah. Well, it's ultimately all about the material. Even if you had something for lunch today, it was made of something. And it might have been partly manufactured.
Mostly chicken today.
We'll be making chickens here one of these days.
See if we can 3D print a chicken someday.
I look forward to that. Go ahead, Travis.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I was wondering if you had any final thoughts on perseverance or any takeaways that you'd like for, like Dr. McDevitt said, our main audience or intended audience would be the Texas workforce, or, you know, up and coming workforce. So those in high school or anything like that, you know, any takeaways that they, you know, nuggets that you want them to leave here with today.
Well, hopefully these aren't my final thoughts especially on perseverance. I think that probably the best advice I would give is be cautious of good advice. You have to find stuff that fits you. And there's lots of people, including me, who will give you good advice, and some of it fits and some of it doesn't. And then what a person needs to do is be very discriminating in sorting out the stuff that corresponds, pick the nuggets out of all of the advice that you get, and then use those and burnish those nuggets that fit you best, would be my recommendation to anybody.
That's really good. Thank you so much. I think we're...
And hang on to your hair because you can lose it.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us today, and I think this will be a really good message for all of our people that get to watch this video.
Okay, well, love to be of help anytime.
Thanks for your time, Steve. Appreciate it very much.
You betcha, Sean.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. The Nuclear Power Institute is a joint center with Texas A&M University and the Texas A&M Engineering Experiment Station, and is a component of the Nuclear Engineering and Science Center. For more information about our center or about our guest speaker today, please visit our website at npi.tamu.edu and look for us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Thank you.